Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the People Things podcast. Thanks for the amazing response on our first episode. And here we are again with our second episode with my friend Chet, who is going to give us some information and share his experience about social anxiety. And I'm really glad that he's taken the time for us and to be here with us and to really open up about this topic that at least I have felt that a lot of people don't open up about. So, Chet, this is really brave of you to speak with us, and I think this is how we can crush the stigma. So, welcome to our show. Before I hand over to Chet for an introduction from him, I just want to say something really quick about our podcast here. So, People Things is something that I have started. My name is Priyanka Shunek. I'm in Berlin, and it's just a podcast. I'm not doing a series. There's not a specific format, but it's just about conversations that I have with great human beings out there, and sharing our experience of being human beings and the challenges that we face, the challenges and joys that we face in our day-to-day lives. And I think, as I said, right, lot of topics like the one that we're speaking about today is not something that you'll usually find people opening up very genuinely and speaking about. So um, this is what we want to do in the show: to be vulnerable, to create a safe space, and to have great people share their experience with us. So we have Chet today. Over to you, Chet. You want to do a short introduction?
Sure. Hi, thanks, Priya, for having me on the podcast. It's really great to be here. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, I'm Chet. I live in the UK. I've lived here for most of my life, over 4 decades. And for most of that time, I have suffered from social anxiety as far as I can remember for most of my life, as far back as I can remember. And it has been a hugely debilitating
Mhm.
thing to deal with. And I've recently got more of a handle on it, and I've understood it better, and I've started to reverse some of the symptoms or started to overcome some of the symptoms. Although I'm very much a beginner and I'm not an expert on this, but I feel I'm so glad to have an opportunity to speak about it.
Yes, that's wonderful. And I said again, as I said again, this is very brave of you, but also for the audience out there, right? We're not experts. We're not people who know exactly what can be done to change the symptoms and so on. But it's about just having that conversation. It's about having sharing what worked out for you, and also it's not looking at creating like some content which is like, oh, this is how you can just crush this,
Mm.
and you know um and this is the happy ending that everyone can have. That's not the intention at all. It's just being able to share, to be able to create that awareness. So thanks also, Chet, that you brought that up. So I think for our listeners out there, I think one of the most important things also, and I've been reading since we've met. We met on this mental health support group, and
Mm.
I also thought that it was very brave of you to speak there, and you were facilitating this amazing group session. I would have never thought that you've had these symptoms, and it's been so difficult for you to live with social anxiety. So I think for everyone out there, in your words, like what would you say is social anxiety? Like what is the definition of it?
Yeah, so I can talk about my personal experience of it, but I thought also it's useful to have almost like an official definition of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this on the NHS, National Health Service website in the UK. And may I just say, God bless the NHS, because it does people work and we need to protect it. Anyway, social anxiety disorder, according to this definition by the NHS, is also called social phobia. It's a long-term and overwhelming fear of social situations, and then they go on to give a number of symptoms. But I think that is such a concise and accurate description because it does last a long time. And that's really the key thing, because we all experience from time to time discomfort, right, in social situations, obviously, because we can't always be superbly competent human beings. But the key thing about social anxiety is that it goes on and it's reliably present in social situations, in different social situations throughout your life. So that is one key factor in defining social anxiety that's really uh, important and pivotal there. And also, it's overwhelming. So that's why I say this is such a good definition, because it does prevent you from enjoying social situations and really ultimately from enjoying life. Because what is life if not interacting with other human beings, in social situations, at work, all of which are social situations? Because if you're in work, you're interacting with human beings. I mean, that is what most jobs involve. Even if you're, as I found myself in a position in a job that could be considered a classic introvert job, which was coding, which is software development,
Mm.
you still need to go to meetings and interact with your teammates, interact with bosses. And the problem is social anxiety affects those situations as well, because it does prevent you from performing optimally, performing at your best, because you're more concerned about how you're feeling and how badly you're feeling in that
Mm.
situation, and you're focused on that rather than the work itself. It can really affect your performance at work too.
Oh my God, I can't imagine. So you're like totally overwhelmed, you're completely distracted also, right? By these
Right.
feelings. Okay. Thanks for sharing that definition with us, and also like your the way you see it. So that's really, really, really eye-opening for me. And because there's a lot of different definitions floating out there, and also the term, if you look at it, I was like, okay, but is it just that people who have problems with other people, or what it is, right? So I think what would really help is if you could share what it looks like in your day-to-day life. What are some ways that it just manifests?
So again, I'll first quickly refer to this official NHS list, because so much of this is relevant to me anyway. So it says you may have social anxiety if you worry about everyday activities such as meeting strangers, starting conversations, speaking on the phone, working, or shopping. So check, 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 check for me. These are all things that cause me anxiety. So also, you avoid or worry a lot about social activities such as group conversations, eating with company, and parties. Definitely, parties would fill me with horror.
Mm,
Worrying about doing something you think is embarrassing, such as blushing, sweating, or appearing incompetent. The physical aspect of it is really, I think, perhaps underplayed, but you do worry that your physical appearance is obvious to other people, and that it becomes that they are judging you for this, right? That you are panicking, that the panic may be visible on your face, that you may be sweating too much, and that's giving you away. And this sort of feedback loop of anxiety um, gets bigger and worse, and it's a vicious circle, and it ends up making you not able to function really in these settings that we're talking about. And obviously, it's all settings, parties and social situations, but because it can happen at work, it is a hugely damaging thing, I feel, if
mm,
it's not tackled. Um, Fear of being criticized, avoiding eye contact, these are all things you may find yourself doing. And if you're fearing being criticized, for example, performance meetings, feedback on your performance from bosses becomes a huge worry.
mm,
And also speaking up in meetings at work can become a huge problem,
mm,
because you would rather be silent and avoid any attention than
mm.
actually
Got it.
uh, contribute, even though you may be good at your job, you may have the knowledge, and you may have this precise knowledge to contribute to the conversation that's being had in that meeting, and you feel reluctant to do it because you think, I'll be a fool, I'll sound like a fool, I'll look like a fool. And it's a terrible thing. Symptoms like feeling sick, sweating, trembling, a pounding heartbeat, palpitations. The
Mm,
heartbeat is the huge thing. You feel that your heart is pounding out of your chest, and people can see the effect of this, or you certainly feel the
mm.
effect of this, and it affects even your breathing. So it's tantamount to a panic attack, I think, and it can become a full-blown panic attack uh, you know, if the situation feels too overwhelming for you, and if you're not seeking help for this.
Got it.
It is really a very physical manifestation of a mental state, and, and
Mhm.
it and it can be a huge problem.
Forgive my ignorance on this. I mean, but how does this differ? So, this is a very basic question I've had since I've started reading about the topic. How does this differ from people who have just a little bit of a different personality type? Like, for example, for me as well, I'm not that, I don't like parties that much. Sometimes if I'm out with a lot of people, I want to come back to my home and like not really, you know, continue talking with, and I get overwhelmed also if there's too many people together. And it's funny because I work with people, that's my job, but
Hmm.
how is this different from, let's say, someone who's an introvert?
So I think the interesting thing is, I think many people with, I think the majority of people with social anxiety are actually introverts, but it doesn't reverse. So it doesn't mean that if you're an introvert, you'll definitely have social anxiety. You know, it's not
Mm,
causal in that way. And I think the difference is, I think what we share, if you know, people with social anxiety and introverts, what we share is that we need alone time, right? And we need time to recharge our batteries. And I think the thing about extroverts, which is obviously the opposite of introversion, is that they get charged up and they get energy and energized from social situations. And the more
got
they
it.
can interact, the more, in fact, energy they will have. Whereas I think for introverts, we feel drained by social situations generally, and we need to recharge before we can enjoy them again. Doesn't mean we never enjoy them as introverts, but it does mean that we need downtime to recharge and recover. But there's that in introversion. But more than that, on top of that, if you have social anxiety, it's not just that you need to recharge, it's that, you know, in an extreme case, you may avoid going out even
Mm,
altogether because even the prospect of interacting becomes overwhelming sometimes. And in fact, I found myself in not too dissimilar a situation to that because for a long time, I really was avoiding human contact. You know, I stopped working some time ago. And I actually did go into what I call the freeze state for quite a long time. And so I avoided human contact and a lot of normal everyday human interactions I was avoiding because they felt too frightening to me. And that is more than introversion. You know, that is, as I say, this social anxiety thing. That's what I was experiencing there. So it goes beyond. I think you can function healthily in society and contribute to society as an introvert because you have so many qualities. The quality of being receptive, perceptive, analytical, introspective,
yeah.
and note and observation. So observing and noticing what's going on in the workplace and being able to take a kind of bird's eye view, whereas others may be so stuck in and enjoying the hurly-burly of the interaction that they may not have the perspective that an introvert has. But the problem is if you're suffering from social anxiety, you even if you have those traits of an introvert, you may not be able to exploit that effectively because the social anxiety is masking all of that and
Got it.
preventing you from accessing that. Because you may well be able to observe things, but can you then contribute to that? Are you comfortable enough in yourself to relax enough to analyze and contribute back in a workplace situation or any other situation?
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a complex relationship between social anxiety and introversion, but
Hmm.
it's useful to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this answered actually my question. And I think what we also like started speaking about, right? It's overwhelming and it's completely taking you over. So
Mm.
yeah, even if you have these brilliant ideas you want to probably share, it's probably not going to come out that easily, than someone who's, let's say, an introvert and has processed these things and wants to put it out there, right? So
Mm.
yeah, that's super interesting. I'm learning so much from you. Thank you so
No,
much.
thank you so much. I'm learning all the time as well. So yeah, there is so much to know and learn about this. And in fact, that's why these conversations are valuable and why it's important, I think, to examine yourself if you have social anxiety, because you'll learn so much about yourself and you don't know yourself. I think when you first are in the thick of social anxiety, the problem is that you don't know yourself well enough to be able to overcome it necessarily. Certainly, that's what I found, you know, and I think people who suffer from it badly are suffering from the fact that they don't quite understand who they are and why this has happened and how it happened. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think now that we're speaking about this, I also like, you've been on this journey, right? You've also got help. You've also like tried to study it and try to understand. So what is your take on why this happens? Why do people have social anxiety?
And I can only speak about my own personal experience,
Hmm.
obviously, but what I have learned, or what I am starting to learn, it seems, is that time and again, what crops up as one of the root causes, if not the root cause of social anxiety, is a lack of self-esteem.
Hmm.
And allied to that is a fear of judgment from others, which again goes back to a lack of self-esteem, because in that situation, in a social situation or work situation where you're essentially panicking about how you're being perceived and you don't have the confidence to speak your truth and to say what you know and to effectively do the job that you're supposed to be doing, you are worried that others are going to judge you, and you're giving people the power to judge you and your appearance and your performance, and you're giving them too much power to do that. Also, it's often unrealistic because people aren't judging. People are worried about themselves rather than worried about judging you. And they're more concerned about, I mean, often in meetings, people have said that they're more concerned about, when is lunchtime and how quickly can we get out of this meeting and have lunch, or things like that. But in the middle of a social anxiety panic, you don't realize that, and you can't see straight, and you can't focus on that. So you're really afraid of the judgment of others. And the reason for that is that you do not have faith in yourself, right? I think this seems to be what it boils down to. You don't have faith that you are capable, that you are a perfectly formed human being, in the sense that your life experiences have led you to where you are today, and you have reacted as a human being, and you have done nothing wrong in that sense. But you are flawed, but that's fine because everyone is. It may be that others are masking it better than some other people, but we're all flawed. And the problem with, I think, people who have social anxiety, many people have social anxiety, is that they don't, they can't see that, and they can't truly believe that they are good enough, right? That they're good enough, and they don't have the self-esteem. I certainly didn't have the self-esteem. And in fact, it goes beyond that, to be honest with you. It goes to a love of oneself that one needs to have before one can actually flourish in life. Without that, other people's judgment becomes more important than your own. And that should never be the case.
Oh, that's a lot to unpack. No,
I'm sorry.
no. Don't be sorry. I think that's so real. I mean, I don't know, parts of me can relate to what you're also saying. Um, but what are some things that can help people? So we are also, as we said, we're not experts, we're not doctors, we're not studying this field, we just have personal experience, right? So in your case, since you're sharing your story, what are some of the things that people can do? And also, I'd like to mention that when I share this podcast, we will be sharing some links where you can get help, at least Germany and the UK. That's because I'm in Germany, Chet is in the UK, so we will be sharing that with the podcast. But right now, can you mention some of the things that have helped you, really?
Yeah, sure. So I think, and this is a very difficult thing, but the thing that helped me the most, the biggest thing that helped me, was seeking help from a counselor. And I say it's difficult because finding the right kind of counselor, it can be a challenging thing to do, because if you have social anxiety, you're not necessarily going to rush out and want to talk about it and tell someone about it. That itself is an obstacle you have to
Yeah,
overcome.
so that's why I wanted to, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you here, but this is very difficult to do, right? That you finally accept that you need help and actually start looking for help. So how did you come to that? Like, what made you say that, you know what, I'm going to go out there and get help?
What's strange in a way about me, I think, is that I wasn't necessarily always afraid of doing that. In fact, I had an experience earlier in my life with therapy as well, which was reasonably long term, but it wasn't satisfying, right? So it really, I felt it didn't help very much at that time. Although even that was a good experience, because simply talking about how you're feeling is an immense relief. You feel better instead of bottling all this up. I definitely feel that repressing and bottling up is going to damage you, and it's going to make you feel worse. And just the fact that you can talk to someone, even if you feel that the feedback isn't necessarily helpful, even the fact of talking to someone in a non-judgmental environment. And to be fair, I did feel quite safe and I felt listened to. And that was immensely cathartic
Mm,
and a relief and a release. So for me, it wasn't necessarily a problem to speak to a counselor or a therapist, but I can imagine it would be a huge obstacle for some people. And how to overcome that, I'm not sure. All I can say is that, it's if you can logically grasp the fact that it's not good to bottle up these emotions because they will play on your mind, they'll run around in your subconscious mind, let alone your conscious mind as well, and they will drag you down throughout the day. And some way of releasing that is definitely helpful. So if people are actually too afraid to or too reluctant to talk to a counselor or a therapist and find one to talk to, writing this stuff down is
mm.
also very helpful. And in fact, there are books that people can read about this, and we can put some links in the
Yes,
show
for
notes
sure.
about this as well, because now that you've mentioned this, it does occur to me that in fact writing down how you're feeling is a hugely important part of therapy. So even if you're not having formal therapy, the power of writing something down is immense because that is the only way that you access the subconscious thoughts that you may not be aware of, right? Because writing down how you're feeling forces you to complete a sentence. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
unless you're writing in a really chaotic way, which I don't recommend. You should try to write coherently, but not perfect prose that will win the Booker Prize. But you should be writing
Mm-hmm.
coherently about how you're feeling and trying to be honest about that. And the power of that is you will surprise yourself with what comes out. And you will articulate to yourself what your fears are. And that's a hugely important thing. You need to know what you're afraid of before you can tackle it. So perhaps if you are too reluctant or anxious even to find therapy, that could be one way to start as well.
Yeah, I think this is what is journaling, right? A lot of people are doing
Journaling.
it also, yeah. And I also feel that when I write down, especially when I'm feeling anxious, I sometimes when I just take the time to write and process that, I process it in a way that it makes me feel that it's not as bad as I thought it was, and I think that is why also when I was a child and I was a student, the only way I could study was when I could write notes, when I could just write down everything that I have to prepare because it made me feel that my thoughts were a little bit more structured. It was not that foggy in my head anymore. So that's a great tip. So getting help, definitely you recommend, I think, for any kind of, when you're feeling overwhelmed, mental health wise, I think the recommendation is always to find someone you can talk to. And you mentioned now journaling. And what else would you say was like a great moment for you, which
Yeah.
really helped you?
So I will mention like the biggest thing that happened to me. I'll mention in a minute. But one point that I remembered about the journaling as well is what people have said is that another benefit of this is if you write down what you're afraid is going to happen, it's really good because you can look back on it in a week's
Mm.
time when that
Yes.
thing you worried was going to happen hasn't happened, and you can realize that you perhaps didn't need to be so stressed about that event or situation.
I think this is so valuable because I think what the whole world has gone through in these past couple of years, right? Pandemic, war. I think it's everyone's feeling a little bit anxious, and I think definitely writing down these small things that you feel like, not only the big topics that are happening in the world, but the small things that you are feeling that are a deal breaker for you right now, that are really really overwhelming for you right now, and then looking at it a couple of days later and seeing that, oh, it was not that bad at all. Maybe that can help us process these things better in the future. So that's a great tip, Chet, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's really good that you mentioned, things that are happening in the world, because I think if you're a socially anxious person, they bear down on you much harder,
Mm,
perhaps, than they would for other people, because you find it, you may be more triggered by these events because you're too alert, right? That's one of the other things about social anxiety. You're constantly alert for threats. I often feel that socially anxious people have an overactive threat response. I mean, we all need it in life, obviously, because we need to keep
yeah.
ourselves safe, but we are looking almost for threats everywhere. And so things that may be happening out there in the world that are not going to immediately impact our lives may feel like they are, right? I mean, for one obvious example, and maybe we will use this, I don't know, but it was the Ukraine war because it was such a shocking thing when for many people when that war broke out. that it felt almost like the world was ending, right, in Europe at that time. And it can feel like a terrible thing. And in fact, in those moments, that's where you need to do self-care the most. But it may be very difficult for socially anxious people to switch that off, because
Mm,
that is like the ultimate existential threat, the threat to your existence, you feel, you know? And so, yeah, definitely things like that are going to be a huge challenge. And they will add to this sense of being overwhelmed if you're socially anxious. And in fact, for me, that was one of the things, you know, but led me to feel really bad, and finally led me to seek therapy after many years of not having any therapy at all because I
mm,
was so disappointed by the previous experience. And in fact, maybe I should say as well, uh, another trigger for me seeking therapy was a personal experience I was going through with a family situation that was very difficult to handle. And I feel sometimes, you know, it's ironic that the situations that are the most stressful and most difficult and most uncomfortable can often be the ones that lead you to seek help, that lead to a kind of personal
mm.
growth or development that will help you
Right.
sort things out. And that's a bit of an irony, but I guess the lesson is don't be afraid of what's happening to you, because A, it's not as bad as you fear, as the mind can project, but B, it may actually be the key to solving some problems of yours. And that's very hard to believe, but that's what I found. So a few other things that can help you um, tackle social anxiety as well as therapy. I mean, I do think therapy is the most important thing, but there are some fundamentals you need as well, and they are things that scientists have discovered are very detrimental if you don't attend to them properly and they aren't in order. And that's basically sleep, food, and exercise, right?
Mhm.
I can't speak to the details of how to improve your diet and how to exercise well because I'm not good at those things. Although I don't have a huge problem with those things. But recently, I've discovered the obvious value of getting a good night's sleep and how important sleep hygiene is. And there's been research, and I can put a link into the show notes to a Gresham lecture in the UK about recent research into how deprivation from sleep really can actually cause, or if not cause, can really aggravate social anxiety and anxiety in general. So if
Mhm.
you've got social anxiety, it's obviously going to be much, much worse for you if you can't sleep either. And one of the very interesting factors is that when you're actually in bed, if you're struggling to sleep, a counterintuitive thing to do is actually to reduce the time that you spend in bed. So, in fact, go to bed later is seemingly now the more up to date advice. Because if you're going to bed early because you want to spend more time asleep because you're not getting enough sleep, that may not be helping because you're creating an association in your mind with being in bed and not being asleep because you're struggling.
Mhm.
So, in
Right.
fact, going to bed later may be the better advice and getting a compressed amount of sleep, even though it's a smaller amount of time, and then gradually building up from there. And then there have been even more radical approaches to that where they've deprived people for sleep for 25-hour periods and trying to force them to maximize the amount of time that they sleep when they're not being overstimulated. But that's a quite unorthodox approach. But I thought it was interesting that you need to create a strong association between being in bed and actually being asleep. And that really, unfortunately, in this day and age, means switching off devices or making access to devices difficult, like phones and tablets,
Mhm.
etc., because they are the things that keep you awake and, in fact, fuel anxiety far too easily and far too effectively. I
Got
mean,
it.
we are carrying around 24 hours a day anxiogenic devices in our pockets,
Mhm.
right, in our phones. These phones are plugging us directly into sources of anxiety in the form of social media. We're comparing ourselves to other people and feeling inadequate. We're seeing terrible world events being spewed onto our screens in a torrent relentlessly. And, we're consuming it all at a rate that we never have before in human history. So at night, it's even worse if these things are right by our bedsides, right in front of our faces. So we need to switch those off, I think. And that's very difficult, but it's such a key thing. And recently, I personally have discovered the obvious point that a good night's sleep and catching up on sleep, if you've been missing out on it for days or weeks, catching up on it makes you feel so much calmer and self centered in yourself and more capable of dealing with stress and dealing with the stresses of everyday life. And it's got to be one of the most crucial things in life. But of course, food and exercise are important as well.
Yeah, I think the sleep, I think for any kind of mental health condition or just like general well-being, it's so important to sleep well. And I like the point that you also mentioned. I think eh, when I was growing up, I always heard that you need to sleep for 8 hours. So go to bed and try to sleep, but I would not sleep. And now I also feel that when I'm like dozing off and I'm really, really exhausted and I sleep those 5, 6 hours without actually waking up, I feel way better than actually just
Right.
going to bed and then going and scrolling Reddit and constantly like trying to like, then that's not helpful. So really, really, I think good points. Um, yes, so I think I can keep listening to to you all the time. So you mentioned in between that you had one important what do you say realization that you had that you wanted to share with us as well, which really helped you.
So this is So this is where I veer off into mysticism and woo woo. No, not really, but it feels like that to me because I'd had a bad experience with therapy, not a bad experience, but not a very rewarding or productive experience with therapy in the past. I was very skeptical of therapy, and I felt therapy was this kind of um, almost sentimentalized Californian nonsense that we have imported and into our lives that is full of trite phrases and cliches and a kind of patronizing attitude to people. And before I go into that, maybe I should briefly mention I'm not talking about CBT because some people have not much faith in CBT because it seems superficial. And I sort of have that attitude, except that I think CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is
Therapy. Hmm.
the most accessible therapy here in the UK anyway, by the NHS, because the NHS is struggling to provide
Hmm.
mental health resources. But CBT is often administered and preferred as the therapy to deliver here in the UK because it's short term and effective, and it can provide results and numbers and statistics. And it is good at providing relief or even elimination of symptoms of, for example, certain fears. Like I think, for example, fear of spiders could be one thing that people
Hmm.
often complain about. Even something bigger like fear of public speaking can be tackled with CBT, which is where you monitor your symptoms and keep a record of them, and you attack it from a very um, pragmatic and structured approach, and almost like a plan of battle, a battle campaign plan. But um, so I'm not really talking about CBT because I think it's effective in the right place, and you can even do it yourself. But it obviously helps if a therapist is guiding you through that process. So I'm not skeptical of that, but I think for some conditions you need to go a bit deeper. And what I found worked for me was something that seemed to have been very deep. Before I did this thing, I was very skeptical, as I said, of all forms of therapy because I didn't believe it. It seemed incredible to me that any of these techniques like mindfulness, so even self-observation, people would say, even previous counselors would say things like, you need, you're too, they told me I was too I looked at everything through a negative filter. I looked at
Hmm.
myself through a negative filter and maybe the world through a negative filter. And I needed to step back and see things from a wider perspective. And I would say, step back to where, right? Because I feel like I'm floating in a sea of anxiety constantly. There's no solid ground to step on. It's just a sea of fear, right? That's what I thought I was floating in. And so trying to keep my head above water, and I couldn't. So I didn't have faith in these techniques. They seemed superficial. They seemed not to work. However, recently, when I found a new counselor, she suggested an exercise that I should do. And the reason I think she suggested it was because just prior to that, she asked me to complete a writing exercise, which was to honestly write about why I felt anxious and what I was most upset about in life, and for each of us, that'll be something very different. For me, it was a situation that really had its roots in childhood. So I did write quite openly and really quite it was quite difficult to do, but I had to write very honestly about my childhood and certain situations in my childhood. And I think, being honest was what gave the therapist tools and raw material to work with. And it led her to suggest an exercise that I should do. And what that was a self-reparenting visualization exercise. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we have all of us within us, the child part of ourselves, inside our psyches, inside our brains.
Mm-hmm.
If we were well nurtured as children, that is a healthy part of ourselves that is secure and even playful and brings us joy. If perhaps we weren't always well nurtured as children, that child part of ourselves, the inner child, as it was traditionally called, is anxious and almost desperate and in need of comfort. And it is that part of ourselves that can surface as social anxiety and panic. So this self-reparenting visualization exercise addressed that part of me. And what it was I had to visualize myself as a young child at a moment in time when that child was in distress or very upset or in discomfort, and then visualize myself as my current adult self approaching that child, putting a hand on that child's shoulder and comforting that child, saying, I'm here for you, I'm proud of you, I love you. And
Mm-hmm.
while doing this, you have your own hand on your heart in the present day, in the real world. And you do this. And it takes 2 minutes, right? And I did this. And I had no expectations of this. I was very skeptical of this because it seems silly, honestly. I'm a very skeptical, rationalistic person. And it seemed like a nonsensical thing to do almost. But I gave it a go because I had faith in the therapist. I trusted my therapist and I wanted to change because I was feeling terrible by this point in life generally. And I did it. It took 2 minutes. I felt like I wanted to cry and I stopped because I'm a toxic male and I don't like to cry. So I stopped it because I felt tearful. And I thought, okay, that's done. And what effect has it had? I don't know. 5 minutes later, I was half watching the television, and this is the part that's going to sound bizarre, but I was half watching the TV, and I felt this strange sensation bubbling up from deep within me, deep inside me, and it took over my whole body. And I was quite alarmed at it for a moment. I thought, "What on earth is this?" And then I realized it's a sensation that you Earthlings call joy, which I'd never experienced before. And it was as if pure joy and love was radiating out of my body into the universe. And I feel foolish and bizarre saying this because I'm a rationalistic, logical person, but that's the only way I can describe it. And I sort of sank to my knees, giggling at the kind of the novelty and the wonder of all this. And it transformed me. So this 2 minute exercise completely transformed my the way I felt about myself and about the world. Because up to that point, I was in quite a bad place, to be honest with you. It was quite a dark place. I was feeling very, very low and depressed and socially anxious, obviously. But as I said, I'd been basically in a freeze state for many years and had cut off contact with society and the world. And it was my world had become very small. And so at this stage, I wasn't even going out much. I did this exercise. I felt this joy and love. And the very next day, I walked all over town. It was like a different world. The sun was shining, the birds were singing. I was walking outside. I was sitting on park benches, reading a book. I was chatting to people. It was incredible the difference it made. I can't say this will work for everyone, but and obviously I can't because everyone is unique, and that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
tragedy of human existence in a way. We all have unique histories and problems, so one solution doesn't fit all. But what it I think demonstrates is because I am a human being after all, I have that in common with everyone. Transformation is possible. That's the lesson that I learned from this, which I never believed at all before.
This is so fascinating. And you've told me this story before, and this was like, it almost made me cry after you said it the first time. I think it's like I think the message that I want to go out there is not that this is the only way that you can, face your issues, and this is exactly what's gonna help you, and then you can go and sit in the park and enjoy, listening to birds and so on. This is not the message I want, but I want people to know that you addressed that you had an issue, you took it in your hands, you worked towards trying to find some things that can help you, right? You made yourself accountable, and you also didn't give up. You didn't lose hope. And then after all this hard work of working on yourself, you found something that helped you,
Mm,
right? And
mm,
I want people to know from your story that it is possible to find these things. It's just sometimes just not that easy. And hope and resilience and really fighting for yourself, advocating for yourself to get this kind of support. I think everyone is worth that. Everyone can be different, everyone can have different things that can help them, but everyone is worth fighting for, for themselves. So
right.
thank you so much for sharing that with us. This is yeah, I think this is my favorite part of our conversation so far. And I'll be honest to the audience as well, right? You told me this and you also suggested that I should try, but it's not something for me.
Mm.
But what inspired me was again that I need to take my own journey, and I need to really fight for myself. So thank you so much for sharing this so openly with us, Chit.
Yeah, you're so welcome. To be honest, with you, it's something that I find endlessly fascinating myself because as I said, I didn't believe, and I love talking about it because I couldn't believe it was even possible before. I think what you said is exactly right. But actually, I think it will work for some people, because I do think that the inner child issue is something that a lot of people will be sharing because so many people with social anxiety, for example, have the self-esteem problem, which goes back to childhood. I think our formative years kind of set the um, tone and set the mold for who we're going to become, and
Mm,
we need to address who we were before we can change who we are. But what it's also actually revealed is that you cannot, through sheer intellectual understanding, change yourself. Right? You do need to take a leap of faith and try things that perhaps you are skeptical of, like I was. And it's revealed that on some level, we are actually biological machines, right? We're not magical creatures, right? It depends on. Obviously, some people will believe that there is a kind of almost animated magic. I don't want to use certain words, but that there's that we're animated by some kind of ineffable thing. But what this kind of exercise has revealed to me is that we're biological machines that can be reprogrammed almost, by exercises like this, by interventions like this.
it's almost like rewiring your brain, no? A
Yes,
bit.
yes. It's exactly the problem is we're rewiring our brains. We do not have the manual. Right? That's the problem. We
Yeah.
don't have the manual for our own
Mm.
brains. Does anyone have the manual? Perhaps, but they're not sharing it widely. It's on the dark web
That's
somewhere. We
but
have
that's
to
why we're
go.
here. That's why you're
Yeah,
sharing. And that's why
that's
I feel
it.
that's really brave. Because I
Yeah,
think I want this conversation to help a lot of other people out there, and yeah, this is so helpful and so inspiring. But the last part of and I can really keep talking to you, as I
mhm,
mentioned before,
mhm.
but I think the last part I just wanted to be like for someone, let's say I was your friend or sibling, or I am your friend, I know that, but for someone who is still very close to you, what would be some tips that you would give them that will help them empathize with someone dealing with social anxiety?
It is very difficult because obviously it will depend on the person in question and
Mm,
how
yeah.
they see this problem. But we'll assume that they are a sympathetic human being and really want to help. Even then it's difficult because if they are not affected by these issues, it's very hard to believe, for example, that just going out is a huge hurdle, right? I think a friend who wants to help should try to understand that a person with social anxiety can sometimes feel that a perfectly harmless situation is almost like a life or death situation. And they need to have the empathy for that, and not really push that person. Because I don't think, of course, exposure therapy is something that can work for social anxiety. Gradually exposing yourself to more and more frequent contact with human beings, even if it starts, for example, with just saying hello to the person in the local shop or something like that. That can work. That's exposure therapy. But I think a friend should not necessarily try to push someone with social anxiety in situations. Say, pull yourself together. Let's just go out. Pull your socks up. That doesn't work. And it's really having the empathy to listen to that person's fears and understand where that's coming from, and really, to listen and to be there, and to be a friendly ear. I think is often the best thing that someone can do. And not to judge that person, and understand in a way that the person with social anxiety is not necessarily broken. As I may have said before, they have simply reacted to the circumstances that forged them, that created them. And I think that may be a bit vague, but I think empathy is the key thing there, understanding and not pushing that person too hard, but listening and being able to help when you can. I mean, in a party, for example, if the socially anxious person needs to take time out or leave, be sympathetic to that, and if you can, even enable that if necessary. Although that, as I said, that's not always the best long-term solution, but in some cases that will be needed. A socially anxious person may be overwhelmed by that situation. So, to be understanding and non-judgmental, I think, is the only thing I can really suggest. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think just one question to that. Would you, let's say, have appreciated, or like in any work setting or any, I don't know, family meeting or something, that if you're not speaking up, if someone put you on the spot, would that be something you appreciated because someone created the space for you to speak? And or would it be like considered as pushing, that you didn't want to be pushed?
Again, it so much depends on the situation. I think what would, for example, in a work situation, I think what would be really helpful is, yes, in a meeting, giving time and space for a socially anxious person at a work meeting to actually speak, and allocating time and respecting that time. Because too often in these work meetings, it's the loudest voices that get heard and no one else gets a chance to speak. And I think if somehow it can be facilitated that a socially anxious person, or even sometimes an introvert, is given the time and space to speak and contribute, I think that's essential, to be honest with you. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Often, as I said, it's the people who are the most voluble who just run away with the meeting, and it's not productive, because that person, the socially anxious person, the introvert, is there for a reason, and they're not being allowed to do their job, and that's not fair. And it may be even that a written contribution is the way to do that, but I don't think that's ideal. So yes, in a work situation, I think some accommodations need to be made, and I think that would be appreciated by socially anxious people. But I think in family situations and, in situations like that, it's much more difficult, especially family situations, because the family dynamics can vary so wildly from case to case, family to family. And I can imagine certain family situations where I wouldn't have wanted to be pushed into the center, into the spotlight, but in other occasions I would. And so it's very hard to know how to deal with that. I think it's to ask the socially anxious person what they would prefer. I think also in advance of if it's a party, a family party or event or something, for example, ask them in advance what they would like, and then respect that, because it's not going to be something that's going to disrupt the party or make everyone else miserable or cause a problem for other people. It's just being considerate of everyone's needs and not just, again, the loudest people's needs.
Got it. I think this is something that I've also heard in the coaching world, and I've like is asking for permission. It goes a long
Right.
way. Just ask for permission, and don't catch anyone with surprise. Tell them in advance that this is what you're going to do, and if you come to some kind of working agreement, and that might actually help. Because there's someone who knows how you are as a person and is accommodating this, and is the intention is just good to help you out there. So I think this makes a big difference, rather than just trying to push someone into just speaking and trying to force them. So I think we've covered a lot, and we've had such an amazing conversation, and I think this is really helpful. I cannot thank you enough for being on our podcast.
Can
And
I say one last thing before we wrap up?
yes,
I'm
please,
sensing that
yes,
you're
please,
wrapping up, because I think another crucial thing, which I should have said actually before, is that
yes,
what is hugely helpful is finding other people who suffer from this and not isolating yourself. So finding other people who have the same problem. I have found is immensely reassuring and validating because suddenly you're not alone, right? So I
Yes.
found it through support groups online. And that is often helpful for socially anxious people because you can connect online and then you can switch off after the 1 hour or however long the meeting is, and you can like decompress and de-stress and relax. And you don't in-person meetings may also be good if you can cope with that too. But I found online is really, really helpful. And just the fact of talking to other people, hearing their experiences, and finding often how similar their experiences are to yours and how they feel in certain situations, how similar that is a hugely validating thing because I certainly hadn't had that kind of experience before, where I've found so many other people who are
Mm.
going through the same thing. And you think, oh, right, so I'm not unique. I'm not some weird case, weird
Yeah.
edge case that's
Yeah.
broken and that's right beyond repair. In fact, there are other people there who are out there who are going through the same thing, and sometimes worse than me. And it's very valuable. And not only do you feel help, then you can help others too, and you can become involved and really support each other. And you've made a human connection, which is
Mm.
what socially anxious people find so difficult. You've
Difficult.
made a
Yeah.
human connection, and it's essential. I feel it's almost essential. Anyway, that was the
No, no,
thing I
I'm glad
wanted
you
to get to.
stopped me, and I'm
Yeah,
glad I didn't
yeah,
end the podcast without hearing that. That is super
yeah.
important. Community,
Mm,
finding people who are similar to you,
right,
because I think a lot of times, a lot of our issues, we think they're only happening to us,
right.
and that's actually a very dark place to be in. So I am really happy that you shared that. And yeah, we'll also share some links. Maybe I think meetups is also
Yeah,
where a lot of these groups exist, right? So
yeah.
yeah, so once again, thank you so much for sharing with us, for opening up with us, and I don't know what to say. I'm just blown away. I think this is going to help a lot of people, Chet. So I really, really want to thank you
Oh,
for that.
thank you so much, Priya. And I think you're a brilliant advocate for, inclusion of all kinds of people in the workplace. And I'm so proud and honored that you asked me to be on this podcast, which I really love and I've listened to and with great enjoyment and admiration. And it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Yes, then until next time. Thanks for listening to us, everyone, and have a good day, good evening, whatever part of the day you're in right now. So bye bye.